Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Rent Prep for Landlords. This is episode number 277, and in this week we're going to be talking about the California real estate boom and the fact that it's over. And we're also going to have some other recent news coming out from Minneapolis and also some rent control that has been recently launched, and we'll get to that right after this.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
So we'll get through this relatively quickly because we're going to bookend this episode with talks of California. So I teased that there is some rent control that has launched recently, and that is of September 14th, 2019. I'm reading this article from Times of San Diego. It says that landlords, developers are okay with California's landmark rent gouging law. So millions of California renters are about to receive some of the nation's strongest protections against rent hikes and evictions. And the primary advocacy group of the California landlords is okay with that. It says that state legislators today passed AB 1482, a bill from Assemblyman David Chu, a Democrat from San Francisco, which limits annual rent increases to 5% plus the rate of inflation, which is typically 2 to 3%. Now, you may not have property in San Francisco or California, but this is why this is important, because it said that this particular bill was modeled after a first-in-the-nation Oregon measure adopted earlier this year. The bill also requires landlords to provide a just cause for evicting tenants and in some circumstances pay for tenants to relocate. So we see this all the time. Some state is the first of its kind. Other states watch, they see how it unfolds, and then they do it as well. And now we're seeing rent control being very popular, as we're seeing that happening right now in New York as well, in New York City. So, looking further into this article, the one interesting caveat takeaway here, and once we get to the euphemism of the article, which is that the Assemblyman has been very careful to frame the measure as anti-rent gouging as opposed to typical rent control. And he said that the reason he says that is that there is nothing preventing landlords from raising rents when a tenant leaves, a provision called vacancy control. And that is often associated with how rent control worked decades ago in places like Santa Monica and Berkeley. So that is a very worthwhile thing to mention, that when you're looking at rent control, there's probably two variations of it. There's one that includes some sort of vacancy provision. So even if you have a tenant leave and another one comes in, you can't raise the rent on that next tenant by more than, in this case, 5%. But with California, it's saying that that's not the case. It's just more so, which I like, is protecting the current renters from a more than 5% rent hike. And in my opinion, that's a much smarter way of doing it, right? Because you're just going to, if you have a vacancy control too, where you can't even up the rent on a new tenant, that's not going to be good because you're not going to get people that want to develop there or buy properties there. So that's a really interesting story and piece of news coming out of California. We have an article from the StarTribune.com. Minneapolis Council or City Council passes limits on tenant screening by landlords. It's always one of our favorites here at a tenant screening podcast, rentprep.com. This is by Marissa Evans, and it was September 13th, 2019. Basically, Minneapolis landlords will face new limits on their ability to reject tenants because of their criminal history, past evictions, or credit scores under a new ordinance that passed the City Council unanimously Friday. So this comes after the affordable housing crisis in a now renter majority city. And it goes on to talk about some of this bill prohibits landlords from turning away prospective tenants because of older criminal convictions and eviction actions. A number of other cities have adopted tenant screening protections, including Seattle, Portland, and Washington, D.C. Landlords who have mobilized against the ordinance warn that taking away their discretion to screen tenants will lead to higher rents. So the new rule is sweeping public policy change that failed to consider many, many questions that should have been asked, said Cecil Smith, principal and managing broker with Cornerstone Property Professionals. So she does a lot, and I've actually seen this come up in forums and different groups. Basically, the landlord is going to say, you know what, this property is no longer $1,000 a month and a 30% rent to income ratio. It is now a 40% rent to income ratio, and it's going to be $1,100 a month. And that's going to phase out a lot of people that can't afford to live there because rent to income is still a legal screening metric that a landlord can use and they're at their disposal. So that's what happens with a lot of these rent control. We talked about this before. When people introduce rent control, a lot of times people stop buying property in that state because they're investors and they're looking to make money. So there's always fallout that can happen with these kind of initiatives. So it'll be interesting to hear what happens in Minneapolis. If history repeats itself, I would fully expect landlords to push back and there'll be some sort of litigation around this because there'll be something that is considered unconstitutional or something that'll pop up, because we've seen that happen in Seattle. It's happening right now in New York. Actually, 400 landlords and different real estate investors showed up at a casino, Turning Stone Casino in New York, to talk about the new rent control laws and rent laws that went across New York State within the last couple months. So they are meeting right now. There was an attorney there who's actually been on this podcast before, and they're thinking of ways that they can fight back on these new laws that have come out. So you're going to always see this. There's always the tip for that tat, and then it's just going to kind of continue to build. But that is neither here nor there. As I'd like to get to our next article from Forbes.com, courtesy of Ingo Windsor, and I like that name a lot. And the title of it is "The California Real Estate Boom is Over. What Now?" So this one's really interesting, even if you're not in California thinking about investing in California, because it talks about how you can see trends developing from other areas and what that means to maybe where you're investing or areas that you're thinking of investing in. So it starts out by saying if you had invested in a property in San Francisco 5 years ago and cashed out in 2019, you would have made a 50% profit. Never mind the rental income, that's just appreciation. But if you had bought a year ago and sold today, how much would you have made? Well, exactly $0. The California boom is over and investors need to switch to Plan B, which is the answer to the Jeopardy question: how do you deal with a market that at best will be moving sideways but could also drop 20%? So does the end of the boom in California also poses troubling questions for investments elsewhere in the country? Will other tech economies follow suit? What are the prospects for booming markets in Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Texas, and Florida? And will panic selling drive down prices everywhere? So it did in 2018, pushing an already weakened national economy into recession. So it's saying, is this just the Bay Area? Well, it's not. If you're looking at the Bay Area, that had a 0% increase in home prices in the last 12 months. Silicon Valley, 0%. Sacramento, 3%. LA Basin, 4%. San Diego, 3%. But when you're looking at other tech markets, right? Seattle, 1%. That's after the previous year was 13%. Denver, 5%, down from 10% the previous year. Boise, 12%, not bad, but down from 16%. You're seeing every one of these tech markets is down substantially. And like I mentioned earlier, the Bay Area was up 12% last year and then 0% this year. So really seeing this across the board in the tech economies. It's saying, can you blame it on the tech economy? Well, the boom and bust cycles get started when the demand for real estate outstrips the supply, which can easily happen when some people suddenly have a lot more money. We've seen it in energy markets in Texas, in financial markets in the Northeast, and recently in shale oil towns in the middle of nowhere. Talking to you, North Dakota. Well, we've seen it before in California with the dot-coms of the late 1990s. And now we're seeing it in the Bay Area in Seattle, Denver, Boise, Austin, Provo, and even in Raleigh and Atlanta, where tech is less important. The cycle is the same. People with new money bid up real estate until builders produce more or everyone who wants it has enough. Then nobody's left to pay the astronomical asking prices, and these have to come down. So what about the other tech markets? Well, we mentioned earlier Seattle, same situation. And then also looking at Austin, Denver. These are all scary places to invest in right now. What about the other boom markets? So Phoenix, Portland, and Miami have been doing great along with the rest of South Florida. Tampa, Houston, Charleston, and Salt Lake City are all overpriced, and Las Vegas will be joining them pretty soon. Prices have slowed only mildly in these markets, and the local economies remain strong. But this is where the national economy comes into play. No local real estate market can prosper long if the national economy slows, and that's what we're seeing as the rate at which new jobs are being created has fallen from 2% at the beginning of the year to 1.5% right now. Any lower, and the economy is headed for trouble. If that happens, the real estate market will make things worse as construction stops, home buying stops, and high housing costs push consumers to spend less on other things. What's the likely outcome? Well, it said in the 2008 recession, we saw home prices drop in almost every local market in the U.S. as much as 50%. But the author here believes that won't happen this time, even if we're hit with a full recession. Only a few markets like Miami, where the boom has been driven by foreign investors, are heavily overpriced. more likely is that the economy eases towards recession and that home prices in many of the boom markets come to a soft landing. So that's partly because the tech boom is not a temporary surge in wealth. It's created large numbers of jobs for people who made and still make good bucks. It's not just Google programmers with 200,000 salaries, but also the bankers, lawyers, stockbrokers, office landlords, security companies, caterers, and the whole ecosystem of an industry that will probably change radically in the next few years, but will not be going away. So in markets that are not overpriced, you'll see a tremor, but no wholesale selling, because this time there's no systematic distortion like the subprime mortgages that affects real estate supply and demand everywhere. So what can you do as an investor? Well, it's saying, you know what, real estate is actually a pretty good investment, so you can kind of sit still. You should be fine, especially with rentals in a recession, and that you'll be all right. But right now, don't buy in markets that are overpriced, which goes without saying. Consider selling now in the boom markets that are still in good shape, and don't raise your rents in expensive markets. You'll have poor luck finding higher paying tenants when the economy slows. So I'd like to thank Ingo Windsor for that great article on Forbes.com. I found that one really interesting and hope you guys did too. So that does it for this week's podcast. I look forward to catching up with you guys next week, sharing some of the recent news in the industry from the last week. And until then, have a great week and take care.